The grand hall was alive with sound and movement. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light reflecting off the polished wooden floor, and the tables were set with shining silverware and crisp white linens. Guests arrived in their finest clothes, voices full of laughter and excitement, their jewelry glinting under the soft glow. It was a night of celebration, though for what few could recall, yet everyone seemed eager to be part of it. The room was filled with the smell of fresh flowers, roasted meat, and warm bread, mixing together to create a scent both comforting and luxurious. Waiters moved briskly between the tables, carrying trays of champagne and desserts, responding to the needs of the wealthy and important people who had gathered. Every corner of the hall seemed alive, every sound adding to the atmosphere of wealth, comfort, and authority. Among this crowd moved a figure who appeared to belong to a completely different world. He was dressed simply, his clothes plain and neat but unremarkable. He carried nothing but a tray and a cloth, his hands steady and practiced as he polished a glass or straightened a plate. He moved with a quiet efficiency that almost made him invisible. Guests barely noticed him, or if they did, it was only to issue a command or a dismissive gesture. He was a servant, one of many in the large household. But there was something different about him, something unseen by most. His eyes, calm and observant, seemed to take in everything without drawing attention to themselves. He knew the rhythm of the hall as if it were a living thing, predicting where a spill might happen, where a guest might need a refill, or where a dropped napkin could go unnoticed. His life was hidden behind the walls of service, yet he carried a secret that would, one day, change the way everyone in that hall saw him. He had been working there for years, long enough to know the habits and quirks of every guest, long enough to learn the exact placement of every plate and glass. He knew which guests preferred their wine slightly chilled, which ones liked their desserts presented in a specific order, and which ones were best ignored to avoid complaints. Despite this knowledge, he never drew attention to himself, blending into the background as though he were part of the furniture. No one asked about his life or interests. No one paused to notice the quiet diligence with which he moved through the grand hall. Some would smile politely at him, others would snap orders without a word of thanks, and many would not even meet his eyes. This was life, and he had learned to accept it, to exist without expectation, to serve without recognition. Yet he was not just a servant. Beneath his calm exterior, beneath the uniform and quiet movements, there was a talent few could have guessed. Music had always been a part of him, a part of his life before he had ended up in service. He had learned to play the piano when he was a child, first by watching, then by imitating, and eventually by practicing with a dedication that came from passion, not obligation. The piano had become a companion, a friend that listened to him when no one else did. It was an escape, a way to express thoughts and feelings he could never speak aloud. Life had forced him into the role of a servant. Yes, but music remained his true voice, silent yet powerful, waiting for the right moment to be heard. In one corner of the grand hall stood an old piano. It was polished but slightly worn, a relic from the past that had been carefully maintained but rarely played. Guests rarely paid it attention, seeing it only as a decoration, an object that added elegance to the room but had no real purpose. Some had joked in passing about the piano being too old, too delicate, or too useless to serve any real function. Others merely admired its craftsmanship for a moment before returning to conversation, drinks, or laughter. To most it was a piece of furniture, nothing more. But to the servant it was a silent friend, a promise of a world beyond trays and orders, reminder of what he had once loved and what he still carried within himself. He often glanced at it as he moved about, his eyes lingering briefly, fingers itching to touch the keys. But he always forced himself to focus on his duties. To reach for it now would be unthinkable. He had learned to wait, to be patient, to bide his time. The evening carried on, the sound of clinking glasses and laughter mingling with soft music from a distant room. The guests, most of them strangers to one another, engaged in conversation and flattery, showing off their knowledge, wealth, and taste. Some leaned closer to speak in hushed tones, others gestured extravagantly as they shared a story or a joke. The servant moved among them, unobtrusive and quiet, delivering drinks, clearing plates and straightening chairs. His movements were seamless, practiced, and unnoticed. He had learned to read the room, to understand when to step forward and when to step back, to know which guests were prone to anger, which to humor, and which could be ignored entirely. To the guests, he was merely a part of the environment, a tool to be used, a presence to be overlooked. They had no idea that he carried within him a skill that could, in a single moment, silence them all, even as he moved with quiet efficiency. He observed the laughter, the gossip, the subtle displays of arrogance, and the quiet moments of kindness that occasionally flickered through the crowd. There was a story in every gesture, a motive in every glance, and he understood them all without judgment. He noticed a young man struggling to appear confident while nervously clutching a glass. A woman smiling at jokes she did not understand. An older gentleman quietly enjoying the food without drawing attention. The servant moved past them all, invisible yet aware, collecting these small details as if they were notes in a song only he could hear. Life in service had taught him to watch, to listen, and to remain calm in the chaos around him. It had also taught him patience, the most necessary ingredient for someone waiting for a moment that might never come. As the night grew darker, and the hall brighter with candlelight and chandelier reflections, the energy shifted. Conversations became louder, gestures more pronounced, and laughter more frequent. The guests were fully absorbed in their social performance, unaware of the quiet figure moving among them. He carried on as usual, responding to requests, anticipating needs, and avoiding any opportunity to draw attention. Yet every glance at the piano reminded him of the other life he had lived, the other possibilities he had known. He touched the corner of a chair with a careful hand, polished a silver tray with a precise movement, and in the back of his mind, he imagined the melody that could fill the hall, if only he could play. The thought was fleeting, almost a dream. It gave him a small warmth that no laughter, conversation, or praise could provide. It reminded him that beneath the uniform, beneath the invisible exterior, there was still a soul capable of beauty and expression. For a brief moment, he paused near the piano, pretending to adjust a chair nearby. His eyes lingered on the keys, worn smooth by decades of use, imagining the sounds that could escape if only he dared to play. He felt a shiver run down his spine, a mixture of longing and fear. To play here, in front of these people, could mean humiliation, or worse, dismissal. Yet the desire to let music speak was stronger than any fear. It was a secret conversation he could have with the world, one note at a time, expressing what words could never carry. But for now, he kept his secret hidden, retreating into the safety of service, continuing to move among the guests who remained oblivious to the storm of talent contained within the quiet man they ignored. As the night progressed, small incidents occurred that he handled effortlessly. A guest spilled wine, and he was there in an instant, dabbing it with a napkin, moving the glass back upright without anyone noticing the potential embarrassment. A plate tipped precariously, and his hand steadied it, saving the dinner from a minor disaster. Each motion was smooth, unobserved, and appreciated only in the absence of chaos. Yet his attention was never far from the piano. Each passing glance a silent acknowledgement of the friend waiting for him, a friend he had longed to speak to in music. In those stolen seconds, he remembered the hours he had spent learning, practicing, and dreaming, and he promised himself that one day the world would hear him, and they would not expect what he carried within. The grand hall, in all its splendor, represented the divide between two worlds, one of luxury, noise, and attention, and one of quiet, hidden depth and unrecognized talent. The servant existed in the gap between them, moving fluidly, silently, and efficiently. A presence that could be overlooked yet could not be contained. The piano stood as a silent witness to both worlds, its keys waiting for the moment when the quiet would give way to sound, when the invisible would become visible, when the hidden would emerge in a way no one could have imagined. And in the servant's mind, that moment was no longer a dream, it was a promise. He carried it quietly, with patience, with restraint, and with the knowledge that one day the hall would hear something that would freeze them all in astonishment. The evening continued. the grand hall now buzzing with an energy that seemed to grow louder with every passing minute. Guests laughed freely, their voices mingling with the faint rustle of silk and the soft clinking of glasses. Conversations flowed from one topic to another, some light-hearted, some serious, but most were sprinkled with the same kind of exaggerated confidence that came from wealth and comfort. The servant continued his work, moving among the tables, pouring drinks, clearing dishes, adjusting chairs, and keeping himself entirely unnoticed. He was a shadow in the bright room, quiet, steady, and precise, performing every task as if it were an act of devotion rather than obligation. It was during one of these quiet rounds that the first spark of change came. A guest, tall and boisterous, leaned back in his chair with a smirk and raised his glass slightly, drawing attention to himself. His laughter was loud, confident, and slightly mocking. He leaned toward a group of his companions and said, "This party is too calm. Where is the excitement? Someone should play the piano if anyone even can." His tone was joking, but there was a challenge in it. Laughter followed, sharp and eager, as if daring someone to take the risk. Some of the guests shrugged, uninterested, while others chuckled at the idea, imagining a failed attempt that would entertain them. The servant's hand froze mid-motion as he passed near the table. The sound of the word piano seemed to echo in his mind. He felt a pull, a quiet stirring in his chest, that made him glance toward the old instrument in the corner of the hall. He had imagined this moment countless times in his mind, playing in front of others, letting the music speak, but the reality was entirely different. This was not an empty room. These were strangers who would never consider him capable of anything beyond service. A single wrong note could humiliate him. But the thought of staying silent now felt heavier than the fear. The guests' laughter continued, louder this time, and someone else added, "Why not let the servant play? Surely he has had enough time polishing glasses to practice a note or two." The comment was meant as a joke, a cruel tease, and the laughter that followed carried a sting. The man behind it leaned back, amused, expecting the servant to flush, stumble, or retreat in embarrassment. Others nodded in agreement, thinking it would be entertaining to see the quiet man fail in front of them all. The servant's heart raced. His hands gripped the tray tightly, knuckles whitening, but he did not speak. He felt every eye in the room turning toward him, even though most thought they were only watching for amusement. He stood frozen for a moment, caught between fear and the longing to play. He had been trained to obey, to remain unseen, to serve without asking for attention, yet the music within him demanded expression. He thought of the countless hours spent alone at the piano, of melodies whispered softly to himself, of emotions poured into silent practice. This was the moment he had prepared for, even if unknowingly, for all his life. The laughter in the hall, meant to humiliate, became the spark that pushed him forward. He took a slow, measured breath, letting it settle in his chest, grounding him. "May I?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible at first, yet carrying a calm authority that startled even him. He nodded toward the manager, who looked confused and then skeptical. The manager frowned, signaling him to remain in place. The guest who had spoken leaned forward, curious now, expecting hesitation or refusal. The servant's gaze met theirs briefly, steady, and without a word he moved toward the piano. Each step was deliberate, slow, as though he were entering a new world, one that demanded respect and concentration. The hall seemed to shift slightly with his movements. Conversations stuttered and died down, replaced by an air of curiosity and suspense. No one had ever seen him like this before. When he reached the piano, he paused, hands hovering above the keys. The worn wood seemed familiar and alive beneath his fingers. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing against him, but it did not frighten him. It focused him. Some guests whispered to each other, sharing their disbelief that the servant might actually play something meaningful. Others laughed nervously, unsure if this would be a disaster or a miracle. The servant took another breath, steadying his mind and body. He remembered every lesson, every practice session, every quiet moment spent with the piano. It all led to this. The room, full of chatter and noise a moment ago, was now almost completely silent. Every eye was on him, every ear straining to hear, some with skepticism, some with hope they might witness a joke, and some unknowingly anticipating a miracle. He pressed the first key. The note rang out, pure, clear, and precise. It was not loud, not showy, but it carried a confidence that demanded attention. The hall fell completely silent. Even the boisterous guests stopped laughing, glass in hand, frozen mid-gesture. Conversation ceased entirely, replaced by a tense stillness. The note lingered in the air, a bridge between the world of service and the world of recognition, a moment that no one had expected. It was a simple sound, but it carried authority, beauty, and surprise all at once. He continued, moving to a gentle melody that flowed from his fingers like a river. Each note was measured, deliberate, filled with emotion that seemed to reach into the hearts of those listening. Some guests shifted in their chairs, trying to understand what was happening. Their amusement had turned to shock. They had expected clumsiness, a mistake, a source of laughter, but what they were hearing was impossible to ignore. The music seemed to weave through the hall, touching every corner, bringing stillness and attention to places that had never known it. The servant did not look at the audience. He did not need to. His focus was entirely on the piano, on the sounds he coaxed from it, on the story that each note told. The melody began to grow richer, more complex. His fingers moved with an elegance that belied the simplicity of his appearance. The guests leaned forward, eyes wide, trying to grasp the skill before them. Whispers arose, soft and uncertain. Is he really playing? I can't believe it. Where did he learn that? The room was filled with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and curiosity. No one had expected the servant to play like this. None of the jokes, taunts, or sarcasm mattered anymore. He had created a world of sound that captivated every listener, a world in which their social status, wealth, and expectations were irrelevant. The music spoke on its own, and it demanded respect. Some guests felt tears welling in their eyes without understanding why. The melody seemed to echo their hidden emotions, their forgotten dreams and unspoken regrets. Others felt a strange sense of humility, as if the walls of the hall, built on wealth and pride, had momentarily disappeared. The servant's hands danced across the keys, each movement precise yet fluid, controlled yet filled with passion. It was clear that this was not a performance born of desire for recognition. It was an expression of his soul, a language that could not be ignored. Laughter, jokes, and mockery had no place here. Only the music existed, and with it, a sudden shift in perception. The boisterous guest who had mocked him first sat frozen, jaw slightly open, unable to look away. He had expected failure and amusement, but what he saw and heard was astonishing. The servant's quiet dignity, combined with extraordinary skill, had created a moment none of the guests would forget. Others who had whispered jokes before now sat in tense silence, unsure how to react. They had underestimated him entirely, and the weight of that misjudgment pressed upon them. The hall, once filled with superficial chatter, was now suspended in time, held together only by the sounds emerging from the piano. Every note the servant played carried meaning, a story that needed no explanation. He moved seamlessly between passages of light, playful energy, and deeper, more contemplative sections that touched emotions hidden even from the listeners themselves. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, moved by the unexpected depth and beauty. Some had never stopped to appreciate music beyond simple entertainment, but now they could not help being drawn in. Each chord, each pause, each soft touch of the keys seemed to resonate with experiences and emotions they had long ignored. The servant, so long invisible, was now at the center of their attention without ever seeking it. Minutes passed like hours. The melody rose and fell, creating waves of sound that carried the hall away from itself. The laughter and joking from earlier nights, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of silk and whispers, all disappeared. There was only the music in the moment, the servant and the piano, and the stunned audience, who could not believe what they were hearing. Every eye followed his hands, every ear captured each note, every mind was forced to rethink what they thought they knew. The servant's skill was undeniable, and the silence of the room spoke louder than any applause could have. The unexpected, the hidden, the invisible, had emerged in a way no one could ignore. For the first time that evening, the crowd realized the truth. Appearances could be deceiving. The quiet man who had served them so diligently, who had gone unnoticed for years, possessed a talent that none of them had imagined. He was not a simple servant. He was a musician, a storyteller, a creator of beauty, and he had finally revealed it. The moment was fragile, suspended on the delicate threads of the notes he played, yet powerful enough to demand respect. And though no one yet applauded, every guest felt a deep, stirring acknowledgement, an unspoken recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The first few notes had already captured the room, but what followed was something no one could have predicted. The servant's fingers moved with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone so quiet, so unassuming. Every key he pressed told a story that did not need war. Desby Cusit spoke directly to the heart. The melody swelled, rising like a wave, filling every corner of the grand hall with its presence. The laughter and chatter of earlier had vanished completely, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Every guest had stopped mid-motion, mid-sentence, mid-laugh. As if caught in a spell that held them captive, it was not just the skill that amazed them. It was the emotion. Each note seemed carefully chosen to awaken something in the listener. A memory, a feeling, a sense of beauty they had almost forgotten. The servant closed his eyes, letting his mind guide his hands. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm, but his movements were controlled, precise. He was no longer merely performing. He was communicating, sending a message that only music could carry. The room had become a living entity, each person a part of the story he was telling. Even those who had mocked him before found themselves unable to look away. They could not laugh, could not whisper, could not move without feeling the weight of what was happening. The melody shifted, moving from a gentle, flowing theme to something richer and deeper. It was as if the servant was peeling back layers of emotion, revealing a depth few had thought possible from someone they had never noticed before. His hands flew over the keys with ease, yet each note remained distinct, deliberate. The guests leaned forward, some gripping the edges of their chairs, others holding their hands over their mouths in disbelief. They had come expecting a brief, perhaps clumsy interruption to their evening, and instead, they were witnessing a display of raw, undeniable talent. It was impossible to imagine where such skill had been hiding. It's invisible for so many years. Some felt tears welling up. Tears that had nothing to do with sadness, but everything to do with being unexpectedly moved. The melody seemed to reach inside them, brushing past their pride, their social posturing, and touching something far more real and human. The servant's music spoke of patience, resilience, and a quiet strength that transcended wealth, status, or appearance. The guests, who had spent hours showing off their own accomplishments and possessions, suddenly felt small in comparison to the purity of the sound before them. The music did not ask for recognition. It demanded understanding. And it left everyone in the hall forced to listen with more than just their ears. The boisterous guest, the one who had mocked him first, now sat utterly still. His hand rested on his glass, frozen, his mouth slightly open in surprise. He had thought this would be a moment of ridicule, a joke at the servant's expense. And yet, every note he heard made that expectation crumble. He exchanged quick, questioning glances with his companions, whose expressions mirrored his own shock. No one could deny what they were hearing. It was impossible. The servant was creating something extraordinary, something entirely beyond what anyone had imagined. The hall, filled with voices and laughter just moments before, now existed in a different reality entirely one. Where music ruled and social hierarchies had no meaning, the melody grew more complex, weaving through the air like threads in a tapestry. Each hand moved independently yet harmoniously, creating layers of sound that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. The servant's focus was total. His awareness of the audience had faded into nothingness. He was present only in the music, in the story each note carried, in the rhythm that flowed through him and out into the hall. The audience, for their part, felt caught in that flow, unable to move or speak, suspended in a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly. Some felt their hearts beating faster. Some felt a strange heaviness in their chests. and others felt a warmth that spread from their shoulders down to their fingertips. Each guest experienced the performance uniquely, yet all were united in the shared astonishment of seeing someone so overlooked produce something so unforgettable. It was then that the servant began to move into passages that required not just skill, but courage. The music shifted to a faster, more demanding tempo, challenging him to maintain control while expressing emotion. His fingers flew across the keys, striking chords with precision and grace, never faltering, never hesitating. The complexity of the music seemed to overwhelm some guests, who exchanged worried glances, unsure if the next note would falter. But the servant was unshaken. Every movement, every pause, every rise and fall of the melody was deliberate, as if he had been practicing for this moment his entire life. And in truth, though life had taken him far from the piano for years, the music within him had never stopped, had never been silenced, had always waited for the right moment to emerge. A few guests began to whisper softly to each other, unable to contain their disbelief. How? I never imagined. All these years, and he never showed anyone. Their voices were hushed, but they could not stop themselves from reacting. They had underestimated him completely. The quiet, polite servant who moved unnoticed among the tables was not merely competent. He was exceptional. A true artist whose talent had been hidden behind humility and circumstance. Every gesture, every note, every subtle shift in the music revealed a depth of experience and emotion that none of them had thought possible. The servant was no longer a figure in the background. He was the center of attention, commanding the room with nothing but sound. Some guests found themselves physically leaning forward, drawn to the piano as if pulled by an invisible force. Their hands, previously folded or holding drinks, moved slightly, fingers twitching in time with the music. Eyes widened, jaws dropped, and hearts raced as they tried to comprehend what they were witnessing. A few older guests, who had grown accustomed to judging people by their appearances and station, felt a sudden humility wash over them. They had assumed that wealth, position, and confidence were the markers of talent, of capability, of worth. Yet here, in this moment, none of that mattered. A servant, unseen and overlooked for years, had proven a truth they had long ignored. Talent does not require permission, recognition, or status. It simply exists, waiting for the chance to shine. The servant's playing became more expressive, more daring. He shifted into sections that demanded both speed and delicacy, alternating between soft, tender passages that brushed gently against the ears and loud, commanding chords that seemed to shake the walls themselves. The contrast created a tension that was almost palpable, a feeling that each note was a statement, each pause a deliberate breath of emotion. Some guests gasped involuntarily, their bodies reacting to the music in ways they could not explain. Others sat frozen, unable to look away, trying to take in every nuance, every subtle inflection that passed from the piano to the air and into their souls. Time seemed to stop in the grand hall. The world outside, the conversations, the laughter, the routine of the evening vanished entirely. There was only the servant, the piano, and the music that flowed like water, shaping the space around him. Guests who had arrived with expectations of entertainment or distraction found themselves part of something larger, something rare, something profoundly moving. They were witnesses, participants, and students all at once, learning that true talent could not be judged by appearances or circumstance. The servant's quiet demeanor, his years of humility, had concealed an extraordinary gift, one that now revealed itself in full glory. The boisterous guest, who had mocked him at the beginning, now lowered his glass completely. His face was pale, his laughter gone, replaced by awe and disbelief. He could not have imagined that the man he had ridiculed would produce such beauty, such mastery. The whispers of others echoed in his mind, confirming the truth he could no longer deny. He had been wrong, completely and utterly wrong, about the servant. And yet the realization brought no joy, only humility. A sudden understanding that life's surprises could not be measured by social status or outward appearances. As the melody continued, a subtle smile appeared on the servant's face, almost imperceptible, as though he, too, was surprised by the way the music carried him. It was not arrogance, nor pride, it was satisfaction. A quiet acknowledgement that the moment he had long imagined had finally arrived. He played not for approval, not for recognition, but because the music demanded expression. It was his truth, laid bare before strangers who could not have anticipated the depth and emotion contained within a man they had barely noticed. Every note, every chord, every pause was an affirmation that patience, perseverance, and passion could not be hidden forever. The hall remained in suspended attention, frozen in awe. The guests, for all their wealth and confidence, felt something new, the raw power of unassuming greatness. They realized that all their assumptions had been flawed, that they had judged based on appearances rather than substance. The servant, so long invisible, was now impossible to ignore. His music had transformed the room, altered perceptions, and reminded them of a fundamental truth: true talent and beauty often exist where the world least expects them. As the final passage approached, the music swelled to a crescendo, full of emotion and power, yet balanced with elegance and precision. The servant's hands moved like water, flowing, rising, and falling. Each note a declaration of skill, of patience, of life lived in quiet dedication. Some guests found tears streaming down their faces, while others sat in stunned silence, unable to move or speak. Every ear, every mind, every heart in the hall was fully engaged, captivated and changed. The servant was no longer simply playing a piano, he was commanding the room, telling a story that no one could forget, creating a memory that would linger long after the night ended. The music continued, flowing through the hall like a river of sound, and with every note, the atmosphere changed. The guests who had come to enjoy a simple evening of laughter, food, conversation, were now completely absorbed in the performance. Their faces, which had shown curiosity or disbelief at first, were now fixed in awe. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the melody, carrying a tension and beauty that no one could ignore. It was as though the room had been lifted out of time, suspended between the present and the spellbinding world created by the servant's hands. Some guests leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes wide, hearts beating faster than they expected. Others, who had come for conversation or gossip, found their mouths dry and their minds focused entirely on the music. The servant's fingers moved with a precision and emotion that made it impossible to look away. He was no longer merely playing notes. He was telling a story, sharing a part of himself that had been hidden from the world for years. Each chord, each subtle shift in tempo, spoke of experience, patience, and a depth of feeling that few had ever encountered. It was a story of quiet endurance, of hidden strength, and of beauty that existed without recognition. Waiting for the moment it could finally be revealed, the boisterous guest, who had begun the evening by mocking the idea of the servant playing, now sat frozen. He clutched his glass tightly, fingers white with tension, and stared at the piano in disbelief. Every expectation he had held that the servant would fumble, fail, or amuse had been shattered completely. He leaned slightly forward, trying to understand how such skill could exist in someone so quiet, so overlooked. He glanced at his companions, but their expressions mirrored his own shock. Some had tears in their eyes, others' mouths slightly open, and all of them felt a strange humility that they had not anticipated. They had come expecting amusement. Instead, they had been confronted with true talent, raw and undeniable. The servant's playing grew more intense, moving into passages that required both delicacy and power. The contrast between soft, tender notes and bold, commanding chords created a sense of tension that held the audience spellbound. Some guests found themselves physically leaning forward, drawn into the music as though by an invisible force. Others closed their eyes, allowing the sounds to wash over them, feeling emotions they had long ignored or forgotten. The hall, once a place of chatter and social performance, had become a temple of sound, and every person present was an unwilling but willing participant in its sacred rhythm. No one dared interrupt, not even to speak. The guests had learned, almost instinctively, that this music demanded respect. The laughter and conversation that had filled the room earlier now seemed shallow, trivial, and entirely inadequate in comparison. Every note the servant played carried weight and meaning. It was impossible to dismiss or ignore. The piano, once a background object, had become the center of attention, and the servant, who had spent years moving unnoticed among the tables, now held the power to command the emotions and attention of everyone in the room. A few guests tried to steal glances at each other, their expressions reflecting disbelief and admiration. They whispered softly, barely audible, yet their voices betrayed a sense of wonder. "He's incredible. I never expected this. How is it possible?" Their words, so small and tentative, could not capture the magnitude of what they were experiencing. Some guests simply remained silent, unable to articulate their thoughts, their minds completely absorbed in the story unfolding through the music. The servant's quiet presence had transformed into a force that could not be ignored, a reminder that the true measure of a person's worth was not in appearance, status, or recognition, but in the depth of their passion and the skill they carried within. As the melody swelled, it reached into corners of the hall that had previously been unnoticed. Guests, who had been sitting quietly, observing the room, now found themselves leaning toward the music, drawn in by its power. Some felt a lump in their throats, a sudden awareness of emotions long buried. Others felt their chests tighten with admiration and surprise. The music seemed to speak directly to each individual, bypassing thought and reason, and settling deep in their hearts. It was an experience that transcended social status, wealth, and expectation. The servant, so long invisible, had become the center of attention, not through words or demands, but through the undeniable beauty of his talent. The boisterous guest, who had mocked him earlier, now shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His hands, which had once gestured with confidence, now rested uncertainly on the table. His face, once bright with amusement, now showed a mixture of awe, confusion, and humility. He had thought himself in control of the evening, guiding the entertainment, and yet here he was, powerless in the presence of something he could not have anticipated. His companions mirrored his reaction, each silently acknowledging the reality they could not deny. The servant had exceeded every expectation. Breaking free from the assumptions they had placed upon him, the servant's hands never faltered, never hesitated. His fingers moved with a fluidity and grace that seemed effortless, yet every note was deliberate, every pause intentional. The music rose and fell, carrying with it a sense of narrative, a story that each guest felt they were a part of. Even without understanding its full meaning, some felt sadness, others hope, others a mixture of both. It was impossible to remain unmoved, impossible to remain indifferent. The servant had transformed the hall into a living, breathing entity, shaped entirely by sound and emotion. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes passed like hours as the music flowed uninterrupted, holding everyone in a state of suspended attention. The guests forgot their previous conversations, their social posturing, their roles as wealthy observers. They were no longer in a hall full of people. They were in a world created by the servant's hands, a world where beauty and emotion had the power to silence even the loudest voices. Some closed their eyes, others leaned forward, and all of them felt the same undeniable pull toward the music, toward the piano. Toward the man who had been invisible for so long. The melody shifted again, becoming softer, more delicate, almost fragile. The servant's fingers danced lightly across the keys, creating a series of notes that felt like whispers, as if he were sharing a secret with the room. Some guests felt their breaths catch, their hearts skip a beat. They leaned closer, trying to catch every nuance, every subtle inflection. The contrast between the delicate sections and the powerful crescendos that had come before created a sense of balance and depth that few could have imagined. The servant's music was not merely skillful, it was alive, breathing, and deeply human. A hush fell over the hall. The guests, once ready to mock or doubt, were now completely silent. Every eye was fixed on the piano, every ear attuned to the sound, every mind captivated by the story unfolding. Even the staff, who had moved quietly along the edges of the room, paused to watch. They had seen the servant at work countless times, but never like this. Never had they realized the depth of his talent, the power of his music, or the way he could command attention without saying a single word. For a brief moment, the room existed entirely for the servant, and he filled it completely with his presence through the language of sound. The boisterous guest's previous arrogance had vanished. He leaned back, unable to move, unable to speak, and watched in stunned silence. He had mocked the servant, ridiculed him, and now he was confronted with the undeniable truth. This quiet man, overlooked for years, possessed a talent beyond anything he could have imagined. Others around him shared the same reaction, some holding hands over their mouths, others with eyes wide and tearful. The room had transformed from a place of casual entertainment into a chamber of revelation, a space where humility, surprise, and admiration filled every corner. The servant's playing grew even more intricate, layering melodies that intertwined seamlessly, creating a richness that seemed almost impossible. Each note was measured, each chord deliberate, yet the music never felt mechanical. It was alive, vibrant, and full of emotion. Guests felt their hearts beat in time with the rhythm, some unconsciously tapping fingers on the table or swaying slightly. The piano, the servant, and the hall had become one, connected through sound and feeling in a way that transcended ordinary experience. The music continued to swell, reaching a climax that held the audience in rapt attention. The servant's hands moved with a skill that seemed effortless. Yet each movement conveyed mastery, passion, and dedication. Some guests found tears streaming down their cheeks, while others felt a sudden warmth spreading through their chests. No one spoke, no one moved, yet every person in the room understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The servant, so long invisible and overlooked, had captured their hearts and attention completely, proving that talent, passion, and dedication could never truly be hidden. The final notes approached, gentle yet firm, carrying with them a sense of completion and fulfillment. The melody softened, slowing,